12 minutes after takeoff, the crew received unexpected news. Washington National Airport was closed to traffic due to severe weather conditions. Meteorologists had recorded crosswinds with gusts of up to 49 knots, far exceeding the safe landing limit. Flight 514 was ordered to divert to Dulles, Washington's other major airport, located 36 kilometers to the west in a suburban area of Northern Virginia. December 1st, 1974, Indianapolis International Airport, Indiana, USA. Here, TWA Flight 514 is boarding its 85 passengers for a trip to Washington National Airport. TWA Flight 514 was a scheduled flight from Indianapolis, Indiana, to Washington National Airport in Washington, D.C., with a stopover in Columbus, Ohio. At the controls of the three-engine Boeing 727 were 44-year-old Captain Richard Brock, 40-year-old First Officer Leonard Kreshek, and 31-year-old Flight Engineer Thomas Safranek, all of whom had clean records and no issues noted during training. Completing the crew were 4 flight attendants, bringing the total number of people on board to 92, including 85 passengers. At 10:15 a.m., the 727 was cleared to taxi to its departure runway. At 10:24, the TWA 727 began its takeoff roll, departing 11 minutes behind its scheduled departure time. The aircraft climbed smoothly and set course for Washington. "12 minutes after takeoff, the crew received unpleasant news. Due to bad weather, Washington National Airport was closed to traffic. Weather observers had recorded crosswinds with gusts of up to 49 knots, 91 kilometers per hour, well above the safe landing limit. Flight 514 was ordered to divert to Dulles, Washington's other major airport, located 36 kilometers to the west in a suburban area of Northern Virginia. For the passengers, the news of the diversion was an inconvenience, but not the end of the world. At 10:48, the crew made contact with the Regional Air Traffic Control Center in Washington, D.C. As Flight 514 descended to an intermediate altitude of 23,000 feet, Captain Brock handed control over to First Officer Kreshek, and the crew began a discussion about how they would approach the airport. At the same time, the pilots began reviewing their approach charts to plan their arrival at Dulles Airport. At 11:01, the controller cleared Flight 514 to descend to 7,000 feet and handed them over to the airport's approach control. At 11:04, while the flight was still 44 nautical miles from the airport, the Dulles controller contacted the pilots and cleared Flight 514 for an approach to runway 12.
Good morning, TWA 514. We'll be using runway 12 via the Armel radial.
Cleared for runway 12. Intercept the radial 25 miles from the airport. When the controller told Captain Brock he was cleared for the approach, Brock believed this meant the controller was providing radar guidance. That is, that the controller was already monitoring their position and altitude and would point out any deviation from the proper approach path. He also believed that when under radar guidance, if the controller did not assign a minimum altitude along with the approach clearance, then the crew was expected to descend to the altitude specified for the final approach fix. Their chart showed that the minimum descent altitude at the final approach fix, 6 nautical miles out, was 1,800 feet. Therefore, he told the other pilots they should descend from the current 7,000 feet to 1,800.
Cleared to descend to 1,800? That's the safe minimum until we're 6 miles from the airport.
Roger, continuing descent to 1,800.
But this was not what the controller intended when he cleared Flight 514 for the approach to runway 12. The controller was not providing radar guidance and, as such, believed the crew was responsible for their own navigation, which released him from any obligation to assign them a minimum altitude. This misunderstanding occurred because, in 1974, controllers could decide whether or not to provide radar service to an approaching aircraft. Pilots, however, didn't always know whether a controller was providing radar service or not, and generally assumed that if they were in radar-covered airspace, radar guidance would be provided. When the controller cleared Flight 514 for the approach without specifying a minimum altitude, Captain Brock believed this meant there were no obstacles between their position and the airport. Otherwise, the controller surely would have told them not to descend below a certain altitude. Following this confusion, Flight 514 continued its descent to 1,800 feet, despite still being more than 75 kilometers from the airport. A few minutes later, as the plane continued descending toward 1,800 feet amid moderate turbulence, Captain Brock took a closer look at the approach chart. To his surprise, he discovered that it showed a minimum descent altitude of 3,400 feet between Front Royal and Round Hill, an intermediate point on the route and the initial approach fix. This contradicted what he had been led to believe by the controller. Confusion began to set in.
This dumb chart says it's 3,400 until Round Hill. That's supposed to be our minimum altitude.
Where are you seeing that?
The captain quickly showed them the approach chart, visibly puzzled.
But you were cleared to 1,800, right?
Yeah, initial approach altitude 1,800.
All right, just 1,000 to go then.
Surprisingly, the pilots decided that the air traffic controller's relatively ambiguous clearance took precedence over the minimum descent altitude shown on their approach chart. Even though the chart indicated obstacles on both sides of their path, rising up to 1,900 feet. As they descended, rain and snow began to fall. The aircraft reached 1,800 feet amid a small storm that significantly darkened the surroundings.
Not much to see out here.
I had visual contact with the ground about a minute ago.
Yeah, me too.
While they talked, a burst of turbulence hit the aircraft, causing it to dip nearly 100 feet. Realizing they were dropping below the supposed minimum altitude, the first officer advanced the throttles to climb back to 1,800.
You're good. You're on the right path. Yep.
We should be able to see the terrain again in a minute.
This conversation made it clear the pilots weren't entirely confident in what they were doing. Initially, with daylight and no storm, their doubts felt manageable. Now, with near zero visibility, the altitude discrepancy from the approach notes clearly weighed on their minds. Moments later, another strong jolt. "Easy, boy," said the engineer jokingly, You're gonna make us sick. The aircraft flew over the Shenandoah River, holding steady just below 1,800 feet. Ahead, there was some light, but also thick fog. At 11:09:14, the radio altimeter emitted a chime, alerting the crew that they were 500 feet above ground. This was much closer than any of the pilots had expected. "Whoa!" Brock shouted. "Add some power." Kreshek pushed the throttles forward, trying to climb out of whatever situation they had gotten into. Seconds after the first warning, the radio altimeter chimed again, this time signaling the aircraft was just 100 feet above ground. No one had time to react. Less than 2 seconds later, TWA Flight 514 began clipping trees near the summit of Mount Weather at an elevation of 1,670 feet. The 727 tore through a wide swath of trees before crashing into the ground, skidding across Blue Ridge Mountain Road and slamming head-on into a rocky area. The impact triggered a massive explosion, sending pieces of the aircraft flying over the mountain as a wave of fire swept through the forest beyond. When the wreckage came to a stop, nothing remained that could be recognized as part of an airplane. All 92 people on board perished instantly in the explosion. Local residents reported visibility was just 16 meters amid falling snow and winds gusting up to 74 kilometers per hour that lashed the mountain's summit when they arrived at the desolate crash site. Fragments of the aircraft and its occupants were scattered across an area of over 8,000 square meters. A massive debris field lit eerily by fires and the shattered trunks of countless trees. Emergency services arriving at the scene could do nothing but close the road and begin the grim task of recovering bodies, or what remained of them. When news networks learned of the crash, their first move was to check whether any prominent politicians were on board. Some anchors repeatedly stated that no one important was on board, a phrase deeply painful for the loved ones of those who had died. What had happened? Who was to blame for this tragic communication failure? When the NTSB reviewed the cockpit voice recorder and interviewed the air traffic controller, evidence of a serious misunderstanding emerged. The pilots clearly believed they were under radar guidance, while the controller insisted to investigators that they were not. The pilots believed the controller's statements implied they could descend to 1,800 feet. Meanwhile, the controller believed the pilots were responsible for their own terrain avoidance. Because each side thought the other was in control, no one questioned whether Flight 514 might be on a collision course with the ground. The NTSB found that the controller should have provided radar guidance and issued a minimum descent altitude. However, the absence of this information did not excuse the pilots, who should have exercised more judgment and realized that the minimum descent altitudes shown on their charts exist for a reason. Several weeks before the crash, a United Airlines pilot had used an anonymous incident reporting system to reveal that he had descended below the minimum descent altitude on approach to Dulles after being cleared for the approach, while still 46 kilometers from the airport. That flight nearly collided with Mount Weather, the very site where TWA Flight 514 would eventually crash. United Airlines never reported the incident to the FAA, so other airlines never became aware of the problem. The issue turned out to be far more common than initially thought. Just 30 minutes before the crash of TWA Flight 514, an American Airlines Boeing 727 approaching runway 12 at Dulles had also been cleared for an approach with no specified minimum altitude. In that case, the captain asked the controller to clarify whether they could descend to the final approach fix altitude, and the controller replied that they could not. The flight continued without incident. With such confusion occurring multiple times a day, it was only a matter of time before a pilot failed to ask for clarification, descended too early, and struck a mountain. When it came time to issue the final report, the 5 lead investigators could not agree on whether the pilots or the controller should be held responsible. A majority of 3 ruled that the pilots were ultimately responsible for their own approach clearance, though they acknowledged that their failure was influenced by misleading and ambiguous instructions from the air traffic controller. 2 investigators dissented, writing that the primary cause was the controller's failure to provide the pilots with a minimum descent altitude. Procedures were significantly clarified after this accident. Controllers now explicitly use the word maintain when referring to an assigned altitude until the aircraft is established on a segment of the approach. Pilots now understand that previously assigned altitudes remain in effect until a specific clearance to descend is issued. This flight is also notable because the crash drew unwanted attention to the Mount Weather facility, a key hub in the federal government's continuity of government plans in the event of a nuclear war. The crash did not damage the facility, as most of its operations were located underground. Despite its major impact on aviation safety, the crash of TWA Flight 514 is largely forgotten today, overshadowed by other, more deadly and dramatic air disasters that plagued the airline industry throughout the 1970s. The numbers from that decade were shockingly high, with a serious accident or incident occurring every 165,000 commercial flights, nearly one serious event every 20 days. The nuances of approach procedures never captivated the public the way dramatic mechanical failures or outrageous design flaws did. 50 years after the crash on Mount Weather, the forest has regrown over the site where the wreckage of Flight 514 came to rest. The crash, its aftermath, and its implications are the subject of the 1977 book Sound of Impact, The Legacy of TWA Flight 514 by Adam Shaw. In 2015, a documentary titled Diverted, TWA 514 was released. Roscoe Cartwright, one of the first black generals in the U.S. Army, died in the crash. He had retired from active duty a few months earlier and was traveling with his wife. This was one of 2 Boeing 727s that crashed in the United States on that same day. The other was Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 6231 in New York State, which was en route, carrying only crew members, to pick up the Baltimore Colts football team in Buffalo.